Want to really learn how to use one of the most helpful plugins to come out in the last 10 years? Well, in this video, you're going to learn my own personal workflow for setting up OekSound Soothe 2 for any instrument in your mix. Let's get right to it. Hey everybody, Dylan Pines here with Musician on a Mission. I've got another tutorial for you. This one's going to be over OekSound Soothe 2. The big reason I wanted to make this, there's tons of reviews online for this plugin, and it really is something special, something totally unique, but there's not a lot of tutorials out there to actually show you how to use it. So I want to go through what this plugin is, what each part of it does, and a workflow that you can use to set it up to help you out with any instrument that you might be having a problem with. So to start off, what is OekSound Soothe? It's a really unique plugin. It's like a multiband compressor, but it's not quite one. It's like a dynamic EQ, but it's not quite one. It's like a smart EQ, but it's not quite one. It's like a de-esser, but it's not quite one. It's a little confusing for a lot of people who haven't really dived into this plugin and who are trying to understand why they might even want to purchase it. Like, what's the point of it? So the best thing that I would call it is a resonance reducer. So it finds specific frequencies that cover up the natural sound of the instrument and it turns them down. So that could be room resonances, instrument resonances, it could be low-end noise or string sounds or maybe sibilance or just plain old harshness, just stuff that might be living in the instrument that just sounds really, really bad to the ears. And honestly, that's its bread and butter, is those harsh, bright instruments. So stuff like vocals or drum overheads or room mics, acoustic guitars, bright synths, stuff like that. You also see it used as a de-esser for vocals, and you'll even see it used in mastering, although you'll see it used way more subtly. That's just if there's like a tiny problem here or there. So what does it actually sound like? For anyone who doesn't have this plugin, I just want to show you a few examples just so you can see how this really does help to clean up some really, really bad, resonant, harsh sounds. Instruments where, there's stuff in the frequency spectrum that's covering the natural sound up. So let's start off with this particular instrument. So this mix that I have, it's totally unmixed. It's just raw tracks. And this is an electric guitar that I'm working with. So let's listen to it. So the main thing that I want you to listen for is just these frequencies that are popping out and they're changing from chord to chord. And that happens sometimes with, room resonances or instrument resonances with maybe poorly recorded tracks or tracks with just some weird circuitry stuff going on. You can literally hear just single notes popping out of the entire sound of the chord itself. And when I say notes, I really mean kind of almost like a sine wave sound. I don't mean like the note of an instrument in the chord. That's okay. That's just a part of the recording. I mean something that's not intended to be there. So listen one more time, and then I'll show you what it sounds like after Soothe. And here's after. So I'm going to go back and forth just because it's easier to hear the comparison if it's getting turned on and off over and over again. It sounds clearer, it sounds less muddy, a little bit less harsh. It sounds like it's going to be perfect in the mix for being a nice background electric guitar part. Now let's look at it on an acoustic guitar part. So I'm going to go over here. I'm just going to grab this verse. Let's listen to it. Same thing. You can hear kind of just those almost like sine wave, little like boo, 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 boo sounds that are popping out of there. And maybe even a little bit of weird phasiness that might be happening just because of how they mic'd this acoustic guitar. I want to do the same thing as before. I'm just going to do some before and afters with Soothe. For this one, I actually have two different instances of Soothe in a row. So I'm going to be popping those on and off. It's clearer, right? Whereas that's more phasey, a little bit washier. It's not changing the tone that dramatically, it's just getting rid of some of the gross stuff that I would have to go and get rid of with an actual EQ, with some like surgical EQ. So that's perfect for me because it's not only faster, but also it's a lot less destructive to the audio itself. So finally, let's look at this vocal right here. So here's before.
And when I die, you make my tombstone out of number 9 Diamond Julie.
Right, you just hear there's a lot of nasaliness in there. There's a lot of just resonances that are popping out because it was recorded in a room. It's very obvious that you could hear the room in the background. So you're getting a lot of room resonances. So now let's do that back and forth comparison.
When I die, you make my tombstone out of number 9 Diamond Julie. Turn my body into gold and shape it into chains and rings.
Is it subtle? Yes. Is it helpful? Absolutely. Especially because once I was to go and compress this, all of the nastiness that I'm now getting rid of right here, that would get so much louder in the mix. So the fact that I'm getting rid of it now and that I'm getting rid of it from note to note is a huge help because it cleans up the sound so that my mix can be easier and better. So let's talk about each of the parameters of Soothe, because you've obviously heard what it sounds like now, or rather what it doesn't sound like, because that's kind of the point of it. There's a lot of stuff going on here. It might be a little confusing as to what actually you need to be doing. So we're just going to go through this rapid fire. So let's talk about these main controls here on the left first. And let me go actually grab the electric guitar just because it's going to be easier to hear this stuff. Okay, so first off, we're going to talk about depth. So over here on the left side, depth is really just how aggressive in level the cuts that it's making needs to be. The higher the depth, the greater the amount of reduction. And the lower the depth, the less the amount of reduction. It's a little bit like a mix knob in a way. But you don't want to go too far because you start to get some weird over de-essing sounds. So let me just show you what I'm talking about. And if you turn it down, very, very small. So next up, let's talk about sharpness. So sharpness is kind of like the width control of this plugin. It controls the Q of every single one of these little EQ nodes. It's like a smoothing effect. So let me show you what I'm talking about. You see as I get lower, these become very wide cuts. As I get higher, they become very, very small cuts. Still just as deep, but we are widening them or sharpening them. Now on to the next one, selectivity. So with this parameter, you're basically telling the system whether you want it to look for frequency areas or for specific frequencies to cut. So it's similar to sharpness, but sharpness is really just controlling how wide or thin the actual cuts are, whereas selectivity is changing how wide or narrow the plugin itself is searching for places to cut. So this is for our actual cuts, and this is for what we're trying to find. Thinking of it this way, lower sensitivity is going to cause more obvious tonal shaping because it's looking for a larger range of problematic frequencies. But higher sensitivity is going to make the plugin focus more on the sharper cuts. So let me show you what I'm talking about. And let me put my sharpness kind of in the middle to make this easier to see. So all the way up to 10. You can see the width of the cuts is not changing, but what cuts are being prioritized are. If I take it down, that width is still the same, but you're seeing fewer and fewer cuts being made, which is going to cause more obvious tonal shaping. It's finding the places where whenever it is to turn those down, it's going to really, really change the tone. And if that's what you're going for, perfect. If you're going for something a lot more subtle, you're probably going to want higher selectivity. So now let's look at attack and release. And this works the exact same way as it does on a compressor. So a faster attack means that these EQ cuts are going to occur right when they get triggered. Whereas a slower attack, well, that means it's going to wait for just a little bit, just a few milliseconds, before it actually applies the cut. And the exact opposite with the release. A fast release means it's going to get rid of the cut right when the plugin is no longer recognizing that as a problem. A slower release means it's going to hang on to that cut for just a little bit longer. So you'd use these in the same way that you'd use them on a compressor. And we'll go over this a little bit more once we start talking about workflow. So now let's look at soft versus hard. So these are actually the two different algorithms that Soothe has to use. Soft being the default, it is a lot easier to use, it's faster to set up, and it's a lot more transparent. There's usually a lot less artifacts that are created whenever you push it pretty hard. Whereas hard, on the other side, this is an algorithm that is a lot more active and a lot more extreme. It's there only if soft mode really just isn't cutting it for a particular instrument. It's actually great for saving a poorly recorded track. If a track has just tons of problems, hard mode might be the way to go. But it's very, very easy to overuse. So now that we've looked at the main controls, let's look at these parametric controls, which is the part that really trips a lot of people up. I actually like to call this area the focus graph. And here's why. Each of these bands on this graph, right here, these adjust the sensitivity of this frequency range, not the volume, because this looks like an EQ, right? And you would expect that if I was to boost this, at 500 hertz, let's say, that the volume of this area around 500 hertz would get boosted, in the same way that it does on an EQ. But it actually does the exact opposite. By turning this up, we are saying, hey, Soothe, I want you to focus a lot more on this area of the frequency spectrum. I want you to be a lot more sensitive right here. So that means you're actually going to be getting more cuts the higher this goes. And on the flip side, if I was to take this down, I'm telling Soothe, hey, I want you to focus less on this area, which means I'm going to be getting fewer cuts. So in theory, in comparison to the rest of this, I'm kind of going to be boosting that area. So just think about it as a flipped EQ. If you want more aggressive cuts, you want it to be higher in that area. If you want less aggressive cuts, you want it to be lower in that area. And if you want no cuts at all, then you're going to want to use these filters just to keep it from actually being processed. So let me show you what I'm talking about. As I move these up and down, you're going to physically see the size of the cuts change. See, that's a lot harder. If I take it down, almost nothing is applied. But if I take it up, it's a lot more aggressive. Each of these bands works in the same way that an EQ does, as far as just, Q, frequency. You even have a balance if you wanted it to just focus on the left side or the right side. It's a little bit more advanced. And then you have sensitivity, which you could think of that just as like the gain if you wanted to. You could just say, okay, well, I want it to be less sensitive, so I want it to be set here. I honestly would ignore the number itself, and I would just either look at the cuts that are being made, or more importantly, I would just use your ears. I mean, that's really the advice that gets given all the time in these types of videos for a good reason. The final thing to look at about the focus graph is my favorite part of this plugin, and that is the listen parameter. And for me, it is what I base my entire workflow around. And all it does is it just solos out this band and allows me to see exactly what it's listening to. So if I click this and I hit play, it allows me to listen as I'm moving it around and find where the most problematic part is so that I can focus in the plugin on that spot. It makes this plugin so much easier to use, and it also makes it much, much easier to find the actual problem spots so that you can cut those instead of just cutting everything in the frequency spectrum. So now that we've looked at our main controls and we've looked at the focus graph, we've just got a few extra controls to look at that you might want to use if you're getting into a little bit more advanced work. So first off, let's talk about quality. That basically just controls the oversampling and the resolution rate. Both of these just control how accurate the plugin is. In the same way, if you see resolution or oversampling on other plugins, it does the exact same thing. The difference being that you can select real-time stuff and offline stuff. What this means is I could say, okay, I want to oversample at 2 times the regular sample rate while I'm mixing, but when I'm bouncing, when I'm exporting, I want it to be 4 times as much. And the reason this is really helpful is because you can actually have the plugin run at a higher quality during the bounce itself, which you couldn't do during the mix because it uses a lot of CPU power to do that. Now, you've got to be really comfortable with this plugin before you do that, because obviously it will change the tone a little bit, hopefully for the better, but it's not something that I would do the moment you start using this plugin. It's something that I would ease my way into. Then farther down, we've got a few parameters that you see in a lot of different plugins. Soothe 2 has actually added a sidechain, which could be really helpful if you're wanting, if you're wanting the plugin to just listen to maybe the kick, but be compressing the bass. It might be something that would be very, very helpful for creating space in between two instruments. Then farther down, you see the mix. I mean, it's just a mix. It's the same thing as any plugin. It is a wet, dry mix. If I wanted it to be fully processed, I'd set it at 100%. If I wanted it to be only half processed and in parallel, then I'd put it at 50%. Same thing with any other plugin. Then down here, we have the trim. This is just a fancy word for your output gain. It allows you to turn the plugin up if the amount of stuff that's getting lost is causing you to lose a lot of loudness. Sometimes this is unnecessary, sometimes it's not. It kind of just depends on what you're trying to do. We're going to go over how to use trim in the final portion of this video when we're talking about workflow. Then we obviously have bypass, which we were using earlier in the video, and delta. So delta is interesting because it shows you just what is being processed. So let me show you what I'm talking about. Let me hit play. If I hit delta, it flips it. So I'm only hearing the cuts. That's it. So it's not something that I personally use a lot. I actually prefer to use that listen parameter down here, but some people find it very, very useful just to see exactly what is being taken away and if it's maybe something that they want to leave in to the actual sound itself. Finally, we have our stereo modes. So we can actually have either left-right mode or mid-side mode, which can be really, really helpful. Maybe if we're working with a reverb and we're wanting to cut some stuff out of the mids, but we're wanting to leave it in the sides, or maybe if we are working with maybe a kick drum, like a kick drum sample, and we're wanting to cut stuff out of the sides, but we're wanting to leave the meat in the mids. That can make it really, really helpful. The balance just basically tells you, okay, on a global scale, do you want it to only process the mids, only process the sides, or some combination of the two? And then same thing for left and right. If I set it to only left, it's only going to affect the left speaker. If I set it to right, it's only going to affect the right speaker. And finally, we have link. So the link function, all it does is it links both channels together and forces Soothe to look at the sum of the two channels to find places to cut. But if I set it to 0% link, then it's going to look at the left and the right independently of each other, and it's just going to pick the biggest problem between those two, and it's going to cut it. So that can be very helpful if you are trying to just get problems that, maybe they're problems in the left speaker, but not the right speaker, and vice versa. And also helpful if you have it set to mid-side. All right, so now that we've gone through all of the parameters of this plugin, let's get into the actual part that you came for this video. Let's talk about the workflow. How do I set up Soothe on my instruments so that I'm getting the best possible quality and I'm getting it done as fast as I can? Now, this isn't a hard and fast workflow that you need to be using. This is just my workflow. Feel free to tweak it to do honestly whatever you want it to do. But if you need a place to start, this is a place to start. So the first step in this workflow is pretty obvious. It's just loading up an actual copy of Soothe, and it's making sure that it's set to flat. So you could either go and change all of these to being flat or whatever. I actually like to go to the factory default presets and click on flat start. And it just flattens everything out. It's really fast. It's really helpful. So step 2 is I'm going to turn the depth up too loud, all the way up, or pretty far up, and I'm going to hit the listen button. So I'm going to click on a band, and I'm going to select listen. Now, if you remember, that's just going to solo this band. It's going to allow me to hear only what this band is affecting. And that's going to help us with step 3, which is to move the bands around until you find the offending frequencies. Let's just listen to this for a moment. We're just going to use this same electric guitar we've been using. And again, let's try to think, where are the problems in this guitar? And I'm just going to mute this for a moment just so you can hear it. I'm hearing a lot more issues in kind of the mids and the lower mids than I am in the top end. At least issues that this plugin is really going to be able to help out with. So that's where I'm going to start sweeping around. So I'm going to hit listen, We'll go from here. Okay, that sounds kind of rough. I'm hearing something there. Yeah, you hear that like boo, 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 right there. Yeah, there's some problems here. So now that I've found that problem area, I'm going to move on to step 4, and that is to tweak the cue width and the sensitivity amount for the band. So I'm just going to basically get it as wide or as thin as I need it to, and then I'm going to actually start to make it more sensitive there. For me personally, I like to get it a little bit thinner so that I'm really targeting in on very specific parts that I know there's a frequency problem, rather than cutting a bunch of stuff that, maybe isn't all that necessary. And then I'm going to turn off listen and just turn my sensitivity up. Awesome. So that's the process for each band. That's all you're going to do. So let me do the next one, because I think I'm hearing some stuff kind of up here that I might want to cut as well. Kind of like right there. Yeah. So same thing. I'm going to change the cue and then the sensitivity. I don't think this needs to be quite as aggressive with its cuts as this one. All right, so now that we've found the spots where we want Soothe to cut, let's tell Soothe where we don't want it to cut. So I'm going to do that by engaging these filters. You don't have to use filters, but for me, it's cutting some stuff kind of in the top that honestly, I don't really need it to cut. That's kind of more of the string sound that I actually want in there because it's going to help the guitars to really cut through the mix. So what I'm going to do is same thing, I'm going to listen. I might put on the listening mode as well. I'm just going to take it down subtly until it's getting to the area where, these cuts that are going really aggressive just aren't quite as aggressive as they were before. Hit listen. So with the filters, whenever you hit listen mode, rather than soloing everything the filter is keeping from being cut, it's soloing everything in front of the filter. So that's an easy way just to figure out okay, this is sort of where I want this filter to stop. About right there is good. So now that we've set our filters, let's move on to step 6. And that's for us to tweak our sharpness. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn the sharpness up enough so that there's less tone suck happening. I don't really want super wide cuts, but not so high that there's going to be artifacts that are introduced to the sound. Because with any of these things, if you start to go very aggressive with the settings, you start to go above what the plugin can handle. You start to get kind of that digital robot-y sort of sound. So I'm going to just turn it all the way down. I'm going to turn it up until it's more transparent. I'm not getting quite as much tone being taken away, but I'm not getting that robot-y sound. See, that's, you hear that psh, psh, that's that kind of artifact thing that I'm talking about. Pretty good to me. Also, the sharper you go, sometimes it ends up sounding a little bit more compressed. For me, I'm okay with that. I was going to compress this anyway. So now let's move on to step 7, which is to tweak the selectivity. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the selectivity up until I get the tonal balance that I want. Less selectivity is more tonal shaping. More selectivity is more transparent. This one is a little bit less of a science, a little bit more of an art. So I'm going to use my ears and I'm just going to listen until it's sounding the way that I want it to sound. And for this particular instrument, I'm looking for transparency, not so much for tone shaping. Okay, that's kind of towards the direction that I want. So now let's move on to step 8, and that is adjusting the attack and release times. Now you're doing this to fit the instrument and to fit what you're trying to do in the same way that you would be doing it with a compressor. So with release, a longer release is going to cause it to work more like an EQ, a little bit less like a compressor. Because as you see, and I'm going to turn it up, it takes so long for the changes to stop that it's almost like it's creating more of a curve that has a little bit of movement rather than something that's happening moment to moment. On the flip side, faster attacks cause it to get turned on immediately. Slower attacks have a little bit of a delay, but they allow the transient of the sound to pass through. They also can cause pumping. Now, if you're looking for pumping, like maybe you're wanting to get kind of a groovy sound, which can happen, if you have a pretty fast release, pretty slow attack, just like you would with a regular compressor, then that's great. But if that's not something that you want to be very careful with how you're doing this. You don't want it to be so slow that you're getting that pumping. You don't want it to be so fast that, maybe it's clamping down and getting rid of all of the attack of the sound, all the bite of the sound. Now, for this one in particular, the attack is so long, the bite of this particular instrument is so long in time that it's not really going to be that big a deal if it gets turned on pretty quickly because it just lasts for a long time. So let's start tweaking. One other nice thing about the release is the longer the release, the less artifacts you're going to get. So if you're getting a lot of artifacts because of maybe your selection for depth or sharpness or selectivity, as long as you're cool with getting a little bit more of an EQ and a little bit less of a compressor, then, you can back the release back as well. Cool, that's sounding pretty good to me. So now let's look at step 9, which is to adjust the depth. What I like to do with this is I like to go all the way down to 0, turn it up, and if I can't find a spot where it's getting rid of all the problems that I'm wanting it to get rid of, then it's time to try out hard mode and start again. I might have to do that because for this one, it's sounding good, but I'm still hearing some of those weird sine wave pitches in there that I'm wanting to get rid of. So let's see what happens. That's pretty good. But if I'm going all the way up on soft mode, I do want to try hard mode. You can already tell if I get too high on hard mode, it gets weird. One quick thing, this is just a fun, quick tip. I love going all the way to 18 on the depth because you get weird robot sounds and it's a cool effect. Especially if you turn the trim up. Kind of sound like it's throat singing. It's messing with the format. Very, very cool to do on vocals, by the way. But anyway, back to the actual tutorial. I like that better, honestly. Even though I'm not going as aggressive as I was on soft mode. This is more transparent, but I'm hearing those high pitches. This is grabbing them a little bit more. So that's sounding pretty good to me. So finally, we are going to get to step 10, the last step. And that's to decide if you need to gain stage this plugin. It's important that I'm saying decide if you need to. This is a rare plugin where I might not say that you always have to. I'm really big on gain staging every plugin from your compressors to your EQs to your saturators, all that stuff. But this is kind of weird because it's cutting stuff that you don't really want to get turned up again. So here's my rule of thumb for this. If you're using the plugin subtly, you're probably going to want to avoid gain staging it with the trim. And that's just because you're going to be turning those harsh frequencies right back up to the level that they were before. And you're going to be turning everything else just up a little bit more. So in context of the mix, that might be what you need. But if you were just doing some editing before you started the mix, it's probably not something I would need to do. But if you're using the plugin aggressively, you're probably going to need to do some gain staging because you're going to lose a lot of loudness. And I'm using it pretty aggressively. So I'm going to do a little bit of gain staging myself. So for me, I really like using a loudness plugin, a loudness meter, just to make sure I'm getting around the same area that I was before. This isn't something you have to do. Honestly, you just use your ears, but I like to just have it open. So let's do a quick before and after. Okay, so we're sitting kind of between 15 and 16. So now let's try it. Okay, now we're doing 17 to 18. So probably 2 dBs. We've lost about 2 decibels of loudness. There we go. That's pretty good to me. So this is the end of our workflow. All 10 steps have been completed. At this point, I might still want to go in and do some tweaking if it's not quite getting the tone that I want or the cutting, the fixing that I want. But in order to do that, I gotta check the before and after. So let's do exactly that. I'm gonna bypass this plugin and bring it back in a few times, and you're gonna hear the pretty massive difference that this has caused. So let's start with before. It's so much cleaner than it was before. And there's obviously so much that needs to be done to this. It's fully unmixed. You know, it needs more compression. It needs some general EQ curves. It needs some reverb, blah, 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 all that stuff. But this is a plugin that I don't like using during the mix. I actually do it during the edit phase, before the mix even starts. And that's just because I'm wanting it to be clean. I'm wanting my instruments to be clean so that whenever I start the mix, I'm starting with the best possible quality that I can, and then go from there. So does this sound perfect? No. Will this sound so much better in the mix after it's been mixed? Absolutely. We've gotten rid of so much of the gunk that was living in this that we would have to fight against during the mix. And now we're not going to have to fight against it. So for me, that makes this plugin a huge, huge help. Couldn't recommend it more. OekSound has made a new piece of tech that honestly, super helpful, especially for people who are doing this stuff in their homes, because room resonances are so bad whenever you're recording in an actual room. So hopefully this has been a helpful video for you, and hopefully you're going to be able to use Soothe to get cleaner tracks. But here's the thing. This is just one small piece of the puzzle when you're trying to get mixes that are ready for the public. You could still get this perfect, and you can still end up with an amateur sound, especially if you're making mistakes in other areas. So that's why Rob Mazes, the founder of Musician on a Mission, he put together a free workshop where he shares the 7 steps to making radio-ready music at home. It's a whole new approach to home recording and mixing. It's gonna help you do all this stuff so much faster. And here's the crazy thing. It hasn't just worked for him. At the time of recording this video, over 60,000 people, God, that number is crazy to me every time I hear it. 60,000 people have already been through this workshop, and they've seen results in their music in just a few days. So now it's your turn. If you want to learn the exact 7 steps that are going to take your mixes to a professional standard in under a year, they're going to keep you from wasting precious time and money and effort on all the wrong stuff, then go and watch this free workshop now. Just click the link on screen or in the description below to get your own access. It's totally free, and seriously, you're going to love it. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. We make tutorials and tips just like this one every single week on this channel. We would honestly love to help you grow in any way we can. All right, that's going to be it from me. This has been Dylan Pines with Musician on a Mission. And remember, create regardless.